Today I'm going to be showing you how I made some THC sugar. Now this was just an experiment I was doing to test out my new vacuum pump, as I was excited to finally have one and be able to use a vacuum chamber. Now I don't recommend you follow this as a how-to, as this is just an experiment I did and I did make some errors. So the first thing I did was I took some cane sugar that I purchased on Amazon and measured 1 cup of it into a measuring container. I also took 190 proof clear spraying grain alcohol that I purchased when I went on a trip to America and measured 1 cup of that into a measuring container. I then placed a beaker onto a hot plate and measured out about 60 mLs of the ethanol and dropped in a magnetic stir bar, as well as poured in 1 gram of distillate. This gram of distillate contains about 900 milligrams of THC. I turned on the magnetic hot plate stir, which started stirring the magnetic stir bar, which helped to dissolve the THC into the ethanol. I also had it on its minimum heat setting. Now this process took about 30 seconds to fully dissolve. During this process, if your distillate does not fully dissolve or there is a cloudiness, then you know that your distillate has been cut with something and is impure. Do not use that for smoking. I also turned on the strong stirring to scrape the remainder from the edges of the beaker, as those can be a lot more stubborn and stuck to the sides. After fully dissolving into the ethanol, I poured the dissolved portion back into the measuring container and it instantly fully mixed. I then added the 1 cup of organic cane sugar to the solution. Ethanol is sufficiently polar to dissolve some glucose. In water, it is hydrogen bonding, which provides the polarity, while in ethanol, van der Waals forces provide the polarity, which are weaker. In molecular physics, the van der Waals force, named after Dutch scientist Johannes Dirk van der Waals, is a distant dependent interaction between atoms or molecules. What this means is that the electrons around an atom are always revolving around the atom. When these electrons happen to be on the same side of the atom, this part of the atom becomes slightly negative. The other part becomes slightly positive. When this happens, on atoms near each other, a brief attraction occurs between the slightly negative side, called a dipole, on one atom and the slightly positive dipole on the other atom. It is not a strong attraction, but when a shit ton of atoms simultaneously line up and this happens, it is something worth considering. I noticed that the sugar was not dissolving very well into the ethanol, so I decided to add another cup of ethanol, hoping that that would help the sugar fully dissolve. I then attached a rubber stopper to the top of the beaker and attached vacuum hosing and pulled a vacuum. This caused the solution to start to boil. I was hoping that this would help the sugar dissolve into the ethanol more, but it did not really assist in the process. It looks like I fully saturated the ethanol and have a large amount of sugar left over. But that's fine for this experiment, as I just want to have the THC evenly distributed across the sugar, and this should be sufficient for that. I then removed the vacuum and boiled the solution normally to help reduce the ethanol. I allowed the solution to boil for about half an hour, which reduced a majority of the alcohol from the solution. I also noticed that the sugar was now beginning to more fully dissolve into the ethanol, so it seems heat helped a lot. I also believe that the 5% water content was aiding strongly in this. I then removed the magnetic stir as I was ready to reduce the rest of the solution and I didn't want it to get in the way. At this point, I was also happy to see that the solution had fully dissolved the sugar. I don't know if this is from the heat or the higher water content as the ethanol boiled off, but either way, this was a good sign, as it showed me that the THC was evenly distributed across the solution. I attached a stopper and a vacuum hose and proceeded to purge the liquid from the solution. My hope was, once fully purged, the sugar would be brittle enough that I'd be able to scratch it from the bottom of the flask. However, once it crystallized, it was very hard and I was not able to remove it from the beaker. So after scratching at it for a bit to test, I decided to pour in half a cup of water to dissolve the sugar so I could remove it, and then I would vacuum purge the sugar from the solution. I applied a light heat for about 10 minutes to allow the sugar to dissolve. I then poured it into some parchment paper that I placed into the vacuum chamber to allow it to boil again. The idea was here that I would pour it into the parchment paper and the parchment paper would be easier to break the sugar apart off of. I put it into the vacuum chamber to heat it so that I wouldn't have to move the solution in between units. However, the heat transfer rate through the parchment paper was very low, and after several hours with low heat, I was only able to dissolve a very small amount of the water. So I decided to pick up the parcel and carefully place it into a glass bowl and place that into my toaster oven. I set the toaster oven at about 95 degrees Celsius as I didn't want this to fully boil. I set it to bake and put the timer on for the full half an hour. In total, I baked it for around 2 hours. When I take it out of the toaster oven, you can see that it has a layer of crystallization on top. I then carefully transferred the parchment into my vacuum chamber. Sugar bonds very strongly to water, so we're going to need to use a vacuum chamber to purge the final portion of water from our solution. Otherwise, we'll be left with a simple syrup if we keep trying to bake it. So here I put it into the vacuum chamber, and you can see it immediately starts to boil away the water from the solution. At this point, it was just run under a vacuum. I did not apply any heat. This simple syrup was starting to look pretty tasty on its own, so I decided to take it off the vacuum and store some in a jar for later. The sample tasted pretty good on its own. I then put it back onto the vacuum to reduce the final amount of water from the solution. But at the time it was looking pretty dry, I decided to open it up and take a look here. You can see it's quite shiny and still very wet looking. There was like a thin layer of moisture on the top and probably a lot of water trapped underneath. I put it back on the hot plate and heated the solution internally to about 40 degrees Celsius, which helped boil off the last portion of the water. And it worked a lot better here. You can see it's forcing its way from the bottom through. I then removed it from the vacuum and gently scratched it with a fork to aid the vacuum in removing the final portion of moisture. After scratching at it gently with the fork, I placed it back onto the hot plate to purge the final amount of liquid from the solution. As the glass is fogging up, we know that there is water being pulled from the sugar. It doesn't look like the sugar is becoming any more dry. However, it did seem quite dry now, so I went and pulled it out of the vacuum chamber. I then gathered all of the sugar onto a piece of parchment paper so that I could break it into smaller granules. To break it up, I just pressed it with a fork. After breaking it all up, I gave it a feel and it was still too moist for my liking. I would have to give it one last round on the vacuum to remove the last portion of water. I placed a fresh piece of parchment paper into the vacuum container and poured the sugar into the vacuum chamber. Here the 2 hours is hyperlapsed into about 4 seconds and you still can't see any change, but it sucked out a lot of the moisture. At this point, it was just about a solid puck of sugar. It was not stuck to the parchment in any way and remained one solid piece. I slid the puck of sugar onto a fresh piece of parchment paper and proceeded to break it up by hand. In the end, it looks like the sugar has yellowed quite a bit. This is likely a result of too much heat causing a small amount of caramelization, as well as some color from the distillate. Once broken up into small enough pieces by hand, I placed them into a mortar and pestle to grind them into granules again. I ground the remainder of the sugar and placed it into a Ziploc bag for later use. Alright, thanks for watching my little experiment. I don't recommend that you follow these instructions, as I would prefer not to have used any water and instead evaporated the ethanol in a better container where I could salvage the sugar from that. So I might do a full tutorial